Oh, yeah.
Okay,
There you go.
now it has started.
That's
Great. All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to the CASP lecture series. So in case this is your first time attending a CASP event, CASP stands for the Center for African Smart Public Value Governance. It's a collaboration between academics at Middlesex University, Mauritius, and our colleague Emamdin in the KPM Center at the University of Bern in Switzerland. So a very warm welcome to you. And our lecture series topic for today is going to be on facial recognition technologies in Africa. So for those of you potentially listening to this video on playback at some point, maybe in the future, if you can't see us, as I was saying, one of our organizers has been overly enthusiastic with the preparation. And given the topic of facial recognition, it's just a coincidence that we're having just a technical issue with setting the video on. So hopefully you are able to hear us and you are able to see our screen as well. So on the topic of facial recognition technologies in Africa, just a little bit of context. When I was preparing the slide about 2 days ago, and what I was trying to see is I did a quick Google search on news websites about what is the topic of facial recognition. Sorry, how is it talked about at the moment? Very broad search. And what I was looking at are instances where facial recognition was used to spot criminal activities. Or it's also about someone finding ways to go about avoiding facial recognition, and including finding new methods of going about criminal activities, such as using a dummy of other people's identity in order to access their mobile banking accounts and so on. So yeah, a very broad search, and these are topics as well that were covered on facial recognition. One of them is from the Daily Mail, or one of the least a reliable source of information there is out there. But the reason why I did the search as it is also to spot about how the topic was discussed worldwide. New York Times was referring to a British case, and in the case of the Daily Mail, that was referring to a situation in Brazil. So the topic here of facial recognition was to get an idea of how facial recognition is being dealt with in different country settings. And yes, of course, the reason why I was doing that as well is to have an idea what is happening on the African continent and so on in different African countries. As I said, a very broad search, and I haven't looked at it into details, but thanks to our invitation that was sent to Dr. Toussaint Notias, today we look forward to delving into the topic in a little bit more deeper. So why we are doing that? It's because at CASP, we are very much interested in the topic of governance, yes, and governance that works as and is in the interest of African stakeholders, and also a governance that is public value led. And also taking into consideration the advent of digital technologies, we are questioning to what extent are public value governance actually adapting smartly to digital technologies. One of the reasons why we are doing that as well is to give importance to the perspectives from African context to the topic. Because otherwise, what we observe, one of our argument is that all of these topics are very much discussed. Yes, they are hot topics at the moment, and we see that they can be traditionally subjected to perspectives that are from European case studies, from North American case studies, and so on. So we, again, do not want to have different countries from Africa and their context be disregarded. Which is why we are looking at the topic today on facial recognition and potentially exploring dimensions of how it can be helped, how it can be used to help smart public value governance approaches or not. So at CASP, we have two primary aims. Theoretically, perhaps as you could have gleaned from what I've just shared, yes, we have a theoretical aim, which is to refine development in organization studies, public management studies, and of course to bring in perspectives from going beyond North American, European case studies, and bring in case studies from Africa. So yes, we are interested in going beyond beyond a Euro-American viewpoint and to input the different perspectives from African contexts. Practically, something that we are trying to do, we wish to contribute to discussions on improving the quality of public governance approaches in Africa, taking into consideration implementation of smart technologies, going beyond just negative dimensions, and acknowledging that when there are challenges as well, these could be potentially smartly addressed on the continent in different ways, using traditional situations, traditional concepts that worked for the context. We are still exploring that dimension. Theoretically and practically, these are our aims as a center. We are now a 2-year-old center, and during our inaugural year, we organized a webinar series where we had different parts of our center's perspectives dissected, okay, from different experts, from different contributors from around the world. So these are available as video records on our YouTube channel in case you wish to watch them. But building on the webinar insights that our contributors shared and the discussions that happened there last year, actually it was 2 years ago, there were sub-themes that we have developed. It's that smart public value governance, it has the potential to tackle some of the grand challenges that we observe, be it around urbanization, climate change, addressing issues that prevent achievement of sustainable development goals. So smart public governance has the potential to do so, especially if it is co-created. And for that to happen, we have to acknowledge the local particularities of the individual country settings, where they work, why they work, or why they don't work as well. So it's very important to acknowledge that. And there is a very much requirement for listening actually to the continent, the different perspective of different stakeholders, and listening attentively to the African continent in order to understand what works for it, what does not work for it, and how to tackle the challenges. So building on those insights, what we did is we combined it, we acknowledged our speakers' contributions, and we built a paper on the topic, which has been recently published, I think about a month ago. And yes, it was in June, and it is published in the Africa Journal of Management. Yes, this is a little bit of self-promotion for CASP. If you are interested in our article, please feel, if you can access it through your institution, please do so. Otherwise, send us an email. We'll be happy to share it with you as well. So this is the research agenda. And very quickly speaking, there were 3 guiding questions that we ask. Who are the relevant actors that need to be considered as the public in the African context that we are studying? And what do we identify as public value? What is public value for the different contexts that we are studying? And leading to our topic for today, for the guest, for the lecture, what are smart mechanisms that identified actors can undertake to create public value? And again, what works for them, what does not work for them, but how are smart mechanisms implemented? So from our article, there are 2 approaches that we propose are and argued to be very important. It's that it has to be a people-oriented approach, and it has to be a concept-oriented approach. So these are two contributions from our research article. It's just a teaser. Please read it and have a look at it if you wish to get a more in-depth idea of what we contributed. And on that note, yes, this, apologies for that. Okay, this brings me to the lecture on today's topic, which is on facial recognition technologies in Africa. And we are very pleased to be welcoming Dr. Toussaint Notias, who will be the one sharing his perspectives. Dr. Toussaint Notias is the Associate Director of Research at Stanford University. And we are very pleased as well to congratulate him on his new position at a very prestigious university in the United States as well. I don't know if it is official yet, Toussaint, so feel free to share it in a bit. But your research, Toussaint, has two streams. The first stream is about representations and stereotypes of Africa in global news. And your other research stream explores digital technology and advocacy across several African contexts. So we were very pleased when we extended the invitation to you and you replied positively. And it's a topic that we are very much interested in hearing more about, in learning more about, and also potentially in guiding future research for us as well at CASP that we may consider exploring from different dimensions or implementing in our way of studying the topic of smart mechanisms, including here the topic of facial recognition. On that note, I've talked too much and I will stop sharing my screen, and I invite Dr. Notias to start his lecture for today.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Adila. And that was actually very, very useful context for me too, to hear about, the work of the center. And so that was really, really great. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for the invitation, Adila and Mamdi, and all the work you've put into it. I was going to say it would be fitting for a talk on facial recognition that we wouldn't see our faces, but you made it, Mamdi, so well done. It works. So I'm glad still that
exactly, I made it.
And so today I'm going to be presenting work that's a collaboration with two colleagues, actually. This is ongoing work. And this is work that I've been doing with Daniel Mwesigwa, who's based at Cornell University, and Lisa Garb from the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. Lisa is a political scientist. Daniel is an information science scholar. And, I thought I'd share a tiny bit about how we got into doing the work that we're doing now on facial recognition technologies. We met, I'm just going to time this. We met a few years ago in 2019 at a conference in Tunisia called RightsCon. RightsCon is the sort of flagship event for the global digital rights community. And when we met there, so Daniel was at the time working in digital policy and digital rights advocacy, in particular in East Africa, doing a lot of work in Uganda, where he's from. Lisa had just been publishing work on internet shutdowns. Some of you may have heard about, governments in different parts of the continent cutting access to the internet, especially around election time. And at the time, I was doing research on US tech companies providing so-called free access to the internet, particularly pervasive throughout different parts of the African continent. And so we met at this conference, and like many other people there, on the one hand, we shared the conviction that digital technologies can be empowering and can support democratization and development goals. But very much so, we also shared concerns and similar concerns about the largely unregulated and unaccountable deployment of these technologies. And in particular, the sort of twin threats that were really at the heart of our interests were corporate data extraction that's been going on in that area, as well as possibilities of state surveillance. And so we got together to do this research on one type of technology that we saw, at the time, really expanding in different parts of the continent, and that's facial recognition technologies. And so I mentioned just a bit of this background so that you understand how we're coming to it. Also to say that this is work in progress, so I very much welcome questions, ideas, and things that you'd think would be interesting to look at in the future. So for my presentation, 4 sort of moments, just so you know where I'm going. First, I'm going to start with some pointers about what do we mean exactly by facial recognition technologies. Then we'll look at where it's expanding and why. Then I'll talk about the risks and harms of facial recognition technologies, in particular in different African contexts. And then I'll end by talking about the future, or really what's ahead of us and what needs to be done. And I think that's where a lot of the governance questions come in. A lot of the questions that your center is interested in would I think, I'd be really keen to engage on a dialogue on this. So before I get to the first part, 2 small disclaimers. The first one, and this is gonna be, I think, a nice echo to what you just said, Adila, in your presentation. The title of the talk is about facial recognition technologies in Africa, but we're very much conscious of differences, or being very mindful of not homogenizing what we're talking about today. But at the same time, especially when it comes to this sort of technologies, we see very similar challenges that countries are facing, especially with foreign forces sort of bringing in their products in many cases. And we approach this still through, continental angle, largely in the spirit of what are the lessons that we can learn in one context that can inform another. It's very much in some ways a spirit of Pan-African solidarity, especially when it comes to talking about regulations and advocacy, which I'll be talking about quite a bit, how different strategies of advocacies or approaches to regulation might translate from one context to another, what are the lessons learned from one country that can be useful for another. And also because a lot of this is a transnational issue, because these technologies are from companies that are operating in different countries, they have a transnational dimension. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I did want to point out that we have that in the corner of our mind. The other disclaimer, too, is that although we have this sort of African continent focus, so to speak, we don't see these contexts as radically different from other parts of the world. Instead, I think we see them as places where we see manifestations of global trends. And so in many ways, what people often perceive as the peripheries of digital technologies actually prefigure what's already happening elsewhere, what will happen elsewhere, maybe in sometimes more dramatic shape. But this idea that there's global relevance here is really important to us. And it's not an original argument by any means. People in anthropology have been doing very interesting work advancing that argument, especially when it comes to questions of development and modernity and globalization. And we extend that to digital technologies here. So with that, I'll get into the meat of the presentation now. So facial recognition technologies. Well, at a very basic level, I think most of you in this room will have a sense of what we mean at the big picture. It's this idea of technology-assisted recognition of facial features. But actually, it's an umbrella term that covers many different things. And I'm going to try to break it down here a bit. The first step often that's involved in facial recognition is what we call face detection. And face detection, what it means is the ability for an algorithm to identify faces as opposed to other objects on an image. This is a human face as opposed to a mirror. This is a human's face as opposed to a hat or lamp or book or anything else. That's kind of the first step. The second step then is developing what we call a face print. And this is where an algorithm would actually sort of measure features of the face to create a distinctive blueprint for that particular face, making it a unique identifier, or supposedly unique identifier of that person's face. once you've gone through these two steps, then we have what happened. We have what we call face matching, and face matching is the idea of comparing one face print to more face prints. It could be to another one, or to two other face prints, or to many more. What does that mean? Practically, well, that means many different things and many different applications. And I'll share four of them here. The first one is identification. So you would compare a face print of, let's say, an unknown person to the face prints of known people. And here the goal is to identify that unknown person against existing face prints that you have. And so this is, what would happen, for instance, when you're running through, a database for immigration, and you're coming at the border, and your face is sort of matched. The face print is matched against existing face prints in other databases, and the idea is to say, oh, we can identify that image is the same as this person with some amount of probabilistic certainty. Another feature is verification. And here what happens with verification, it's comparing a face print of a person seeking, for instance, the authorization to access something, to one or more face prints of that, set of authorized individuals. So I'll give you a very clear example here. When you're using your phone, if you're using Face ID with an Apple device, this would be verification. And this is not something that's necessarily tied to identity. This is something that can be just tied. It might just be able to say, this is a match for this, but we don't necessarily have information about who that person is, but we can tell you, we can verify that the person who's looking at the phone at the moment is the same that the face match, the face print that we have for authorization to access to something. The two other things that I wanted to mention, or application of face matching, are face clustering. And so this is quite different. This happens when all the face prints in a collection of images are compared to one another in order to group images of one person altogether, or to group a group of people together. And this is something that's used, for instance, in context of policing, monitoring people at a protest to create clusters of people, and understanding where they appear in different images. And so this is this sort of sorting and creating groups of individuals. The last part of very prominent deployment of facial recognition technology is tracking. And here the idea is to use face prints to follow the movement of a person through physical spaces. This is what we most often associate with surveillance of protesters, again here. And this is tracking that can be done in real time, but that can also be done on historical footage. So, archive of CCTV camera can be run through software to then, track the movements of a person. So, I mean, these are like sort of very generic description of the applications, but I think, to most of you, you'll get a sense of the range of possible applications of this technology in different domains. And we've been seeing a lot of use of this tool in conjunction with other tools, especially artificial intelligence tools for predictive analytics. And in recent years, we've had scholars making very, in my opinion, dubious claim that these technologies can be used, for instance, to determine a person's political orientation, a person's sexual orientation, a person's predisposition to criminality. And, this may sound a bit like a sort of sci-fi dystopian bad movie, future of, the machine sort of predicting, the personality trait of a person just based off their face. But also in many ways, it sounds like the past. And specifically here, I'm thinking of, 19th century era of pseudoscientific racism. And in particular, this sort of trend of pseudoscience called physiognomy, where, these scientists thought that they could infer criminality by analyzing the facial features of people, using photographs to attempt to do this. And here I'd recommend the work of Abeba Biran, who's a computer scientist who's really done amazing work digging into the connection between historical attempts grounded in racism and current attempts. But this is like a very big picture overview of, what is it that we're talking about in our study when we're talking about facial recognition technologies. And one of our goals was to really try to understand, well, where is it being deployed and why, across the African continent. We wanted to provide a sort of big picture overview of this deployment. And our method to do this, I'll be very brief on this, and feel free to ask me questions in the Q&A. We've largely relied on analyzing news coverage. So we've been looking for news articles that have been published in the past 5 years, either in French or in English, so any article that used the term facial recognition or reconnaissance faciale in French. And we looked at articles both in international media, as well as a range of African news sources, as many as we could find in different databases. And so we did this sort of scoping of the news coverage. And we also did a review of existing scholarly research, as well as gray literature. So there's a lot of civil society groups publishing reports and on these topics. So we've also kind of build up a compilation of that literature. And I'll say just this for the method. I'm happy to answer more questions, but I think there are important limitations to acknowledge. One is that because a lot of the deployment is happening in through the security industry, which is not necessarily an industry that's keen on advertising a lot of this work. There are very secretive deals with police or government forces that are hard to track down. Certainly, the news media are not enough to get to this. We also have linguistic biases, right? Like, because we only have French and English, so we're also missing on a wide other range of news, especially in local news sources. So what I'm about to show you, please take it as more as a baseline of information, more than us telling you like, this is it. But this is, as much as we could find based on that method. And what we found was, country-specific deployments of facial recognition technologies in about 34 countries across the continent, and these being generally, government-led or public-private partnership types of deployments. And actually, let me sort of break down here a bit the domains that I think make the bulk of where it's expanding. Well, I'll just take a second more on this map to, I think, get the point across of how that deployment is something that's been happening already. It's there. It's no longer a question of, when it's going to happen. We need to be ready. It is already, we're in the middle of it. And that has implication for community responses, governance responses, and the urgency that we need to have with that topic. So domains of applications, I think the most widespread one that we found was really around voter registration, election, and we've grouped also digital ID with that here. One example was, for instance, in Ghana during the general elections in 2020, the government procured about 75,000 devices to be used for voter registration. And it was devices that would record both fingerprints and facial features, and actually was only going to use facial recognition in cases when fingerprinting was not enough to identify someone. And this was, a procurement that was about $27 million in terms of costs. And that's something that we're certainly, since we started this research, has been picking up digital ID projects that include facial recognition, is something that's very much picking up in many other countries. The second big domain of application was around policing and public safety. Within that too, a lot of the initiatives around smart city as well as counterterrorism, we kind of group them here. One of the most prominent example has been in Uganda, where the government spent about $126 million US to acquire a surveillance system that includes facial recognition technologies, and that was brought from a Chinese company called Huawei, very much in the spirit of buying it for security and against monitoring of crime in public spaces. That was the sort of framing. Another country that's kind of gone with that same approach has been Zimbabwe, where in 2018 the government signed a contract with Cloudwood Tech, which is a Chinese company, and what they would begin basically the same large-scale facial recognition project. The third domain of application that we found quite a lot of has been airports and ports. In Senegal, for instance, in 2021, it was announced that the Aéroport International Blaise Diagne was going to launch security cameras with facial recognition technologies in Nigeria, and that's from 2023. The opening of the Lekki deep sea port in the southwestern state of Lagos has also been inaugurated and equipped with facial recognition systems. I'm going to run more quickly through the other domains, but that's just to give you an idea of where this is playing out. Education in Nigeria, still we've seen the University of Lagos in 2021, which was donated by a company 4,000 CCTV cameras with facial recognition analytics being used in conjunction with it. We found a brief mention of this, though more details are hard to come by. Banking and fintech is also a domain where a lot of facial recognition technologies is being used. E-governance, and here again an example from Ghana has been the use of facial recognition technologies to verify the identity of people enrolling in the National Service Scheme registration process, and that's something that they rolled out in 2022. The last one that's been very much picking up in recent months, and that connects to the first one, actually, digital ID, is the SIM card registration, where now the registration of biometrics data is becoming tied to the registration of SIM card information. So you have this convergence of data collection for administrative purposes here. When it comes to the actors involved in these deployments, what we largely see are the usual suspects, let's say. Governments, in particular police forces, are driving a lot of the adoption, but they only are able to do this through the intermediation of private companies that are providing these technologies. These private companies are a mix of occasionally local, but mainly foreign companies. You have French and German, Japanese, as well as Chinese companies that are very much involved here. We also found the involvement of foreign governments, and more specifically China, and that's also due to the fact that some Chinese companies have a particular relation to the Chinese state, making it certainly in the media coverage that we looked at, China being a sort of prominent foreign actor in that story. And I hope we can discuss this in the Q&A, what it means that there's this heavy focus on China. And then, civil society broadly is very much part of the story. A surprising finding for us was that actually civil society and nonprofits have been early adopters of facial recognition, especially in the sort of animal conservation, which, as early as 2015, they were using it to basically try facial recognition on lions to track the movement of lions in parts of East Africa and also in Zimbabwe on giraffes. And I mentioned this because, a good part of the nonprofits and civil society that we found in the news coverage were actually fairly welcoming of the technology as a whole, not just in that particular sort of conservation stream, but more generally. And they were sort of seeing seemingly quite a lot of community benefits, and they were in that sense echoing the main arguments in favor of that technology that governments and private companies have been advancing. And these are, in a nutshell, here. If you're interested in technology, that's not going to sound groundbreaking, but it's still the endurance of these same arguments. One is using these technologies to improve public safety, to make, countries and public spaces safer. That's really a very big argument that's widely used. There's the argument of efficiency, that you can speed up some processes, for instance, at the airport, in immigration, that you can be more reliable, that you can go faster in terms of processing a range of administrative tasks. That connects to this idea that it's supposed to be cheaper, or that there's going to be positive return with the use of that technology, especially in the delivery of public services. And then I think the fourth one is a bit more latent as an argument, but it's very much there, and it's this idea that countries adopting facial recognition technologies, or governments adopting them, sends a signal of modernity, and so it builds into a narrative of state building, of nation building, that's very important politically in terms of what it projects for citizens in the country and also to the rest of the world. And so it's no surprise that a country like Kenya, South Africa, or Ghana have been really at the forefront of a lot of this adoption, because these are countries that have also tied a lot of their political identities, I'd say in the last 10-15 years, to digital governance. Now, I mentioned that civil society, a good part of civil society was responding to these arguments, and we could see that in our analysis of the news coverage. But occasionally, there were risks and harms and concerns being raised. We found generally it was about like 1/3 of all the stories. So all the stories we analyzed was about 350 news stories. And about in 1/3 of these stories, you would have concerns expressed by civil society voices. And they made a range of concerns. The first one was that this technology is prone to racial biases. And so this is very much building off the work of many activists and technologists and researchers, particularly in the US, who have, Timnit Gebru, Joy Bolamini, who have shown the technology to be biased against dark-skinned people, with really damaging consequences. It could lead to misidentifying people, for instance, in the context of a crime or, policing investigation. It could also deny access to some services, wrongly deny access to some services. And so because of that, and because, this is something that people in certain parts of civil society are very aware of, the question of racial biases came in quite a lot in the news coverage. And in particular, when it came to a partnership, the partnership I mentioned in Zimbabwe, where the Chinese company providing the facial recognition software was very much providing this, also with this idea that they are basically getting information on how to train their algorithm to be better at identifying dark-skinned faces, so getting a competitive edge over other types of other algorithms from other countries. And so racial biases was one of the sort of big risks and harms that people saw, in deployment of these technologies. Two other risk and harms, and I'm going to group them together here, where, first, what we might call glitch or manipulation, the idea that, the technology, irrespective, notwithstanding the racial biases, can either have glitches, not function, or that the results can be also manipulated. And that was particularly salient in the context of debates around digital ID. And, in the case of Ghana, that I mentioned earlier, these two things were connected, because there was a lot of question raised by the opposition in particular about how the procurement of these devices happened, when people were consulted, how was it actually used, was that the right price that was paid for it, was that a good investment compared to the existing system that was in place. And with any new digital system that you're bringing in, there are like security risk, and so to what extent does it open space for manipulation of the data? That was a whole set of concerns. But I think really the biggest one, the most common one, and the one that for Daniel and Lisa and me matters, I think is particularly silent, was around privacy. And the idea that, the deployment of this technology, in particular in public spaces, is very much threatening not only, your privacy in public spaces, meaning that something like freedom of assembly is being radically defined, in cases where this technology is deployed in public spaces. That means, as a person, you're going to a protest or you're just passing through a public space and you're actually tracked by technology, sometimes without your most of the time without your consent, especially if it's not disclosed. That means that even when you're not online, when you're offline, you're still online in that sense. It's following you. And that's raised a lot of questions that were very visible in the news coverage we looked, in the critiques that we looked at, which was that, deploying and these technologies without regulation, without oversight, might very well lead to mass surveillance system that would reinforce autocratic tendencies. And so in that case, Uganda and Zimbabwe in particular were two countries where the deployment of the facial recognition technology for policing were seen as creating a lot of danger for authoritarian tendencies. So this was the sort of, the panel of harms. And I think, before we can talk about the smart governance, we also need to look at what's, in front of us. And, I showed you that map to show that this is already happening. I'm showing this to you to show that the risk and harms are many and profound. And, in response to this, we've seen quite a lot of, small but intense advocacy. And it's advocacy that's happening at the intersection of human rights advocacy and digital rights advocacy. Or rather, not necessarily, it's the convergence of these two issues. So let me explain this a bit more. We found that when looking at the types of people that were quoted in the news, the types of organizations, many of them belong to local human rights organizations, often faith-based groups that have had a long track record of caring about human rights. The second set of groups were more recent, groups that are very much digital rights specific organizations, and these been either local or regional. So here I'm thinking of an organization like Unwanted Witness in Paradigm Initiative Nigeria, the C4SP, which is a coalition work in East Africa, the Kenya ICT Action Network. And then the third group of organizations are what you see here as global organizations that are organizations like Access Now, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Privacy International, which are organizations that have fully integrated digital and human rights as co-constitutive component of their work of defending civil liberties. And these groups, all together have been very vocal on their stance on the risk of using facial recognition technology, but also in trying to effect change and see how, how to respond to that challenge. And I want to share here just a tiny bit about the case of Kenya, where facial recognition technology came to be discussed in the context of a new identity management system that was introduced or that was proposed in 2019. Some of you, I think, will have heard of this. In 2019, the government proposed to introduce something called the Hudama number, which was going to be an identity card, a proof of identity that would be tied to a centralized database where you would have, it would basically combine the function of a passport, social security card, as well as, a range of biometrics, so fingerprints, facial images, potentially DNA down the line. And so it was this model of a highly concentrated database of very important personal information, all consolidated in one place and then linked to this one card. And so when they announced, the government announced this in 2019 and said, we're basically going to roll this out this year, there was a lot of pushback from these three types of groups that I showed here. And in particular, you know, Kenyan civil society groups were very active. 3 of them in particular: the Nubian Rights Forum, the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, and the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights, who the 3 of them called to halt the implementation. And they basically asked for a pause, and they asked for a stop on the rollout on 2 grounds. One of them was the privacy argument, saying that basically there were no framework in place to make sure that the privacy and that information gathered through that process would be handled in a way that was thought through, that was robust, that was privacy protecting. But they also made arguments about marginalization. And so the Nubian Rights Forum, for instance, which is a civil society organization representing the Nubian ethnic minority group, their concern was that the Udamanamba would further exclude Nubians from political participation, since many of these people lack, for instance, birth certificates, which is a necessary requirement to acquire one of the cards, or at least, you know, when it was proposed at the time. So they were saying, like, if you implement this, you make it a requirement, you're going to exclude a whole range of the population. And so they made this petition, which was successful. There was a high court in Nairobi that ordered a halt to implement the digital ID system until a regulatory framework would be in place. And so that was, a watershed moment for these activists, and also in public conversations in the country, really bringing to light a lot of these issues of data harms, data privacy, beyond the small group of people who care about this usually. But I think many people in that circle in which Daniel, Nisa, and I work on were very pleased to see this advancing public conversation, putting a pause and thinking through a framework. But at the same time, this was only temporary, and it certainly does not solve the issue long term. And also, it was not specifically about facial recognition technology. So although it put a halt on that digital ID project, facial recognition technology is actually very much in use in Kenya and different parts of the country, including by the police, including at airports. And so, I don't want to signpost this. So that takes me to my last slide, and where I have, in many ways more, some thoughts and many questions, and which is, what is to be done here, and what's going to happen, in front of us. And I think there are 3 buckets of areas that we need to pay attention to. The one is regulation, and regulation of facial recognition technologies, of the use of biometrics. And here there are many things that could be done. One could be to mandate the disclosure of the use of technology. I mean, we've spent a lot of hours trying to figure out where it was launched, piercing to years of things. But as I said, as a disclaimer, we're only scratching the surface. And it does seem like disclosure of the use of that technology, especially when used by governments and or by private companies in public spaces, should be a minimum. Consultation of people in the procurement of these services, the establishment of risk assessment frameworks, especially by companies that are subcontracted by governments to implement these technologies. All of that is and should be on the table. But we can even go one step further. That's where a lot of the debates that data privacy experts are having at the moment is about a ban on this technology for at least ban on certain uses. So here are some of the bans that people have been talking about: prohibiting the use of facial recognition technology for surveillance of public spaces by public authorities, be them federal, state, municipal, or otherwise. Prohibit the use of this technology for surveillance of public spaces, not just by government, but also by private actors. Prohibiting the public authorities from using and accessing data and information derived from the use of this tech by private companies. There is very much a collective of people who are calling for ban and refusal of the technology. And it's a sort of a global movement that makes the simple point that civil liberties advocates have always made, which is that something like privacy, once lost, is really hard to regain. And facial recognition technologies, much like DNA, for instance, are taking us one step too far in a direction that we can't come back further. And so now actually is a good time to have a conversation as societies on what are the bounds that we put to these systems. And if you think, me or the people who say these are kind of too critical, just look to even, someone like Sam Altman, who's the CEO of, OpenAI, who's now, all over Washington calling for regulation. And, we can talk about whatever that means, but, even within the tech industry, you have a lot of people being like, I think like now we're at the point where we need to think about boundaries. And I think that connects to that second point of biometric consciousness. This is a term that I'm, here that was developed by Simone Brown, who's a scholar of surveillance. She actually talks about critical biometric consciousness, but by that she means like really creating an awareness among the general population about when our biometric data is being used and for what purposes, and being engaged in thinking about their use. And so some of the questions that I see emerging from that question for different, for African contexts are, how do you bring everyday people in these conversations, people who might not immediately care about digital technologies, people who might care about things like, socioeconomic inequalities and public health and, more what people I think would describe as more pressing needs. How do you get these people to care about digital privacy? How do you bring them in the governance of these technologies? And here, that's where I think there are many opportunities to explore African perspectives, and in particular, what are the set of existing cultural values that might be used to articulate or to make that happen. I'll give you one example. There's, for instance, in data privacy research, there's a big turn towards relational perspectives. And the idea is that, we've thought about privacy for so long, especially among technologists and lawyers in the US and Europe, as this sort of privacy as this individual thing. It's like your own privacy, and we think of privacy of individuals. But actually, this whole movement of scholarship is saying, well, now with digital technologies and data, my data has implications for people in my family, my DNA has implications for my family, my Facebook has implications for my friend. And so my data is not just my data, it's data of the people in my communities. That means that we need to have a relational perspective on data privacy. And if you're interested in, African ethics or African philosophy, that will sound familiar, like Ubuntu philosophy or this idea of interdependence, or that I am because you are. And so what are the pathways to include African ethics in thinking about this technology? I think there's a lot of space for that. Some people are already doing this work. Similarly, there are calls to decolonize technologies or decolonize the regulation of these technologies, of data privacy. And so here there's this question of like, can this long-standing tradition of, anti-colonial sentiment or, national sovereignty, self-determination, can that be leveraged to develop a language to talk about this and bring in everyday people in debates? And the third bucket of big questions here, which I think is really massive, is this idea of that what's happening is the privatization of public goods, because even as governments have their own incentives and reason that depends from country to country to lead the deployment of these technologies, they constantly rely on private intermediaries to make that happen. And because so much of how the technologies are being used is for things that would fall under social services or provisions of public goods, we really find ourselves in this situation where the technology is driving further that process, and it's spearheading that process. And it's not something that I've seen part of the media coverage, for instance. It's not something that came up, but I think there are like really implications for what it means as governments and states are implementing these technologies. They're further accelerating their dependencies on private companies, often foreign companies, for a lot of their governance. Nanjala Nyabola, who's a Kenyan author, talks about the 2017 elections in Kenya, where when the votes from the elections were challenged by the opposition, a court in the country has to have access to the data of the elections, so the votes, the national votes. And it turns out, because the company that was overseeing this was a French company, all the data was, or most of the data was physically located in servers in France, making them out of the jurisdiction of the Kenyan court, meaning the court didn't have the means to, to make that company comply to actually hand over the data, and the company didn't hand over all of the data. And so that, I think, to me, is a compelling example of why what's at stake here is, goes beyond issues of privacy, but also to these broader trends. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to questions and anything else.
Thank you so much, Toussaint. Very, very interesting lecture topic, very interesting presentation, with a lot of ideas on my side personally, and a lot of questions as well. But yeah, I should not be monopolizing the time and the questioning. Are we able to invite participants to ask questions? Imamdin should work, right? Yeah. Okay. So thank you to our attendees for being present today and for listening to this lecture. So anyone has a question? Yes, Clément.
Thank you very much, Toussaint Notias. Thank you for that great presentation on facial recognition technology in Africa. I've got a few comments. Why facial recognition technology in Africa is different to European or European one? And then what are different challenges do you think are specific to African context, which may be different to European one? And then the second question I wanted to find out, what are different ethical challenges do you think face facial recognition in Africa? That, I think, is a more complementary to the first one. So what are different? I think the issue of finding the ethical consideration, ethical challenges are very, very important. To find a comprehensive ethical challenges are very, very important, because this can help us for the future regulations. Because if we are able to identify different ethical, to have a comprehensive ethical challenges, this can help us to develop a policy we're going to address those issues. So I just went through data privacy, and you went through citing data privacy, but not kind of have you guys developed a comprehensive ethical challenges such as data privacy, responsibility, accountancy, data confidentiality, security, security, reliability, autonomy, social impact, and equity. I'm an assistant professor. I didn't introduce myself. I'm an assistant professor of business ethics and the corporate social responsibility and the sustainable development at the REN School of Business. So I would like you maybe to kind of find in the context of Africa a comprehensive batch of ethical challenges that face these technologies. So, and then also you also repeated something which is interesting. How this fit to African Ubuntu philosophy and African culture. How this fit to African culture? Well, this actually is coming from European perspective. It has been implemented in Europe. How this really fit to Ubuntu, African culture, or African perspective? Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, that's great, and greetings from Brittany. And so, on your first question around, what's different between African context and European or American context, and what are the specific maybe challenges? I think one of the big difference is the place of the state, and I think the question of the prevalence of the state as an actor, and as the sort of defining actor of the economy and of civil society, is something that's quite different. But I think that relates to the challenge, the difference in the challenges too, right? Where Europe, for instance, has done, quite a lot of regulation in terms of data privacy, but the lack of, regulation, and I don't like to use the framework of lax here, but the lax regulation, and they are lax for a reason, where both companies and states have vested in, companies have vested interest in regulation. States have often just, not necessarily the investments in it, and also sometimes vested interest. But I think, one of the particular challenges is the, how do you develop, then implement context-specific data regulation? And, they've been, to be sure, and they've been, and there is a lot of efforts by people who work in digital rights and data privacy across the continent to create either both at national levels and also at continental levels frameworks. The Malabo Convention, which was a treaty on data privacy, which was developed. There's all these attempts to develop this, but I think and they're all great, but we need more investment in supporting these efforts. We also need to bring everyday people into this conversation, and this should be a matter of actually election topic. It should be something that people talk about in programming and choosing politicians, and it should become part of that everyday culture. And so on your third point about African cultures and philosophy, I mean, that's where I hope people will take the do more research. And I'm not the only one. Many other people have said, like, we need to look at this. One of our fellows at the lab at Stanford, it's called Sabelo Mlambi, and he's done work precisely on relational ethics and Ubuntu philosophy as a framework for assessing ethically development of technology. And I think there's so much more that could be done, because Ubuntu is like the go-to example when people are looking at African ethics, but I think there's much more to be done beyond this, and looking at how faith and religious framework might be leveraged to think differently about data privacy, but also facial recognition. There is something about what does it mean for our relationship to our face. I don't know about you, like in different parts of the world, I know that people, the convention around whether you look someone in the eye, how long and when, are very different. And so they're like culturally different, specificities that we need to think about, even just for facial recognition itself. What does it mean, this acceptance of our faces being constantly monitored in public spaces, and you either knowing about it or not knowing about it? And so I think here a lot of research with users, people in countries, doing surveys, doing ethnographic research to see how people think, make sense of that, would be very useful. I have a good colleague in Kenya called Leah Komen, and she's done work on women and their use of mobile phone. And, she was really looking at the perspective from the ground up, and how women actually make sense of, their privacy on mobile phones. And that looked very specific to their context and their lived experiences. So bringing that in, I think, is just where a lot of exciting research can happen. Thank you, Clément. I see Jess has a hand up.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Merci à vous.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it's really nice to see you all and to hear this presentation. Thank you so much. There was a lot that was very rich in it. And I think it's funny that both Clement and I are at business schools, because of course there's a very particular interest in this, in the kind of corporate space. And I actually wondered if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that more. So I look at what's happening in South Africa, and what we see is that most of the facial recognition work is being done by private corporations, particularly corporate security companies, but obviously not only. I mean, a lot of it is also banks. And I can't get into my internet banking without having my face recognized at this point, which I then know means that my face has been sold through as a data set to all kinds of other corporate entities. And I mean, in Mauritius, you see this at kind of almost every level. And there's this parallel, like alongside this kind of corporate moving forward, which, as you say, is largely unregulated. You've got a kind of almost a neo-Cold War happening over the fundamentals of digital infrastructure in terms of fiber optic cables and so on. And it feels from here as if it's only actually the corporate sector that even has the technical understanding to be able to engage in the regulations, whether you're looking at Meta or you're looking at a South African bank. So I just wondered if your research had kind of explored the private sector across the continent at all, or whether this was an area that is kind of ripe for exploration. I mean, what is happening with the kind of non-civil society, non-government space where a lot of the actual money flows around the internet and its technologies? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. No, that's really great. So, I mean, that's where, so we're co-authoring this research. So I know the corporate actors, both Lisa and Daniel are very, that's where they're very interested. That's actually why they wanted to, when we started this, they were very interested in like, how can we find out information about the companies that are actually selling these, and so we actually like, scraped a few business databases, trying to look for, companies in, operating in different African countries, providing, security and facial recognition. That was actually really hard to do. We also tried this with LinkedIn, and so I think, I mean, there's definitely way more research. And I think, the fact that, what you're mentioning about the corporate being the spearheading this, I think is totally right. I think, I emphasize the state just because I think the nature of the state is different in these countries, but I think the dynamic of the private actors taking over, all these sectors and cementing their position, and especially in transnational perspectives, right? Because they're often, I don't know in the case in Mauritius, but banks are often transnational, multinational corporations. As private security companies are making a point of pride of operating in 40 plus countries around the world and so on. And so it is in that sense a global trend, everywhere. So in terms of I'll look at the corporate actors in the paper, I think, or in the chapter, it is going to be this sort of fairly basic sort of overview of different companies. I was surprised, like, one of the leaders is Japanese company, German, French companies, very important. One area where I'm more interested than my colleagues is digital rights advocacy, like what makes resistance possible, what makes engagement possible, what are the anchors in different countries that can activate this or not. Why is it that, we have movements like in Kenya where, you have actually groups get together and then push forward, strategic litigation, whereas that's not something that's been happening in Uganda. And so what are the conditions of possibility of resistance to these corporate actors in particular? And, if you look at Kenya, and, you talked about Meta, Kenya is really interesting because that's where now you're seeing a lot of litigation against the company. And part of it is because, so for instance, you have content moderators in Kenya that are, pursuing lawsuits against Facebook for the working conditions of people working in the country. But you also have, people from Ethiopia who are suing Facebook in Kenya. And so because of the hate speech on the platform in Ethiopia, and they've chosen Kenya for a range of reasons to pursue that litigation. And I know there are many other litigations coming in the books that are transnational in spirit, but also emerging from Kenya. And so, I think, looking both at the corporate actors as well as the possibilities of resistance or accountability are really, really important, especially because, the way corporate actors are one step ahead on the, shaping or capturing the regulatory landscape is absolutely true and spot on. And now we're seeing the same in the US, right? So my past research was on the free basics, like zero rating and all of this. And what I found was that in many cases, Facebook actually wrote the documents that the local telecom operators would take to the regulators to allow them to do this. And, and then that happens between the lawyers from the telcos and, the regulators behind closed doors, no consultation. Don't know how that happens, but it happens somehow. And then Facebook gets to expand its thing. And, with the AI, hype now in the US, we're very much seeing tech companies being like, oh, no, let's get there, right? Like, in the 90s, there was this trope of tech companies being anti-regulation, anti-state, and now they're like, you know, we're already in Washington, so let us come. And so I think, you know, certainly a lot there.
Here's a question from Michael.
Yes.
So his question is, how does facial recognition fit in the broader digital sovereignty and data governance debate? Is it the case that Africa has to adapt to emerging standards, or how can Africa innovate to carve out its own unique policy in terms of regulation? Is this something that should be left to individual states, sub-regions, African Union level? I've read the question for recording purposes. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. I mean, yes, so is it the case that Africa has to adapt to emerging standards? Sure, although the standards are contested, and so I think it's more a question of, you know, these debates happening at all these levels, you know, at state level, at sub-regional level, African Union level. And that's where, you know, that's where, you know, I think the expertise in the room, and then people might be listening, is very important, because how do you make that happen then is a different question, but it certainly needs to happen at all these levels. And I think how Africa can innovate here is it does require investments, quite simply, in people and initiatives that bring a wide range of expertise to think through that. And so it's, you know, expertise that comes from people who do work on data privacy, or lawyers, takes expertise from technologists. They need to be brought into debates, but also everyday people. We can't understand what's going on without having the perspective of people who are impacted by the technology. And so I think that's where a lot of the innovation can happen, and not just in Africa, by the way, right? Like, this is something everywhere, but certainly that would yield unique perspectives from the context of, you know, different African countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Toussaint. And I've other questions from our attendees. Imamdin, sorry, your hand is raised.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much also from my side, Toussaint, for this really interesting presentation. What struck me in a way, and I found really interesting, was, I mean, on the one hand side, you raised, you know, these opportunities that can go even up to nation building, you know, ensure public safety and so on. And on the other hand, there's this risk of, you know, misusing it to become, or to strengthen kind of an authoritarian regime. Have you kind of indications so far what kind of, which path goes one or the other way, certain mechanisms, or do you see approaches what to look at to kind of better identifying the mechanisms that can lead you to one or the other way?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the path on which we are is certainly one where, you know, it's widespread, rapid deployment and adoption. I think compared to a few years ago, there is awareness of the questions of risk and the need for ethics, but that hasn't played out, as far as I can tell, in strong practical ways. And so, you know, the pathways to make that happen, I think, are really either you know, governance-led efforts to involve you know, certain amount of energy and expertise and investment into that space, or community responses, community pushback that's really calling for this. And when I say community here, it's in a wide sense, it can be at the level of a country, but also in transnational perspectives, where you have these groups like digital rights groups like Access Now and Privacy International that are, you know, certainly looking at things like elections and these moments to try to open up spaces to advance this. And so I think the pathways for that are many and should be, the levers should be used at the same, at the same time, from community involvement to, government efforts to, corporate accountability. There's certainly a lot that could be done here. There's an organization called, for instance, Ranking Digital Rights, where when they come out every year with a ranking of how different companies are performing on their indicators of digital rights. And that certainly has an impact within the company, where people are also having these debates. And I think for social media platforms, the companies, there's been a reckoning within them where that can be a lever to improve. But when it comes to facial recognition technology, so much of it is from, security companies that have a different set of values, different ways of operating, different ways of not being in the public eye. And that creates, different questions on, which levers to pull more. But I think, I do want to stress that we're on a path where we're heading for widespread adoption, integration of this technology with others, and without the appropriate frameworks. And so I think a lot of what people are doing, including myself, is, the alarm raising in a way that's hopefully inviting governance, conversation, frameworks, development. Yeah.
And also, I think I have a question which may be related to points that Jess have made, and you just raised as well about creation of appropriate frameworks. Jess mentioned that traditionally the topic of facial recognition is very much embedded into banking sector, business world, and so on. You mentioned the example of the different domains earlier, banking, fintech, and so on, and education was one of them. And the example I think that you gave was in one of the examples, I think it was Tanzania, and the 4,000 CCTV cameras. If I remember,
that was in Nigeria, but yeah, it was
Nigeria. Sorry, yeah. Nigeria, my mistake. It's an interesting case, because my point here is CCTV cameras. Yes, there's going to be facial recognition in schools. For what purpose? Is it for enhancing security, or is it for enhancing attendance at school, for enhancing students' learning? So the purpose of why would it be introduced at the school level is very intriguing, and also the age factor. These would be likely students below 18, I assume, and so on. Of course, I can research this further, but there are a lot of factors in here. And were those CCTVs a donation from a private company, a donation from an external, international actor, and so on? So that point that you raised, I was very much intrigued by it, and it's something that I personally want to explore as well, because for what purpose is it being done, and what is if it is in the interest of enhancing education, how could that be? Okay, I'm asking different questions rather than security and so on. But yeah, I think we can ask different questions as well to see different perspectives. Yeah.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think the education example is really interesting. And you asked the right question, which is like, for what purpose? And it's interesting because in some ways it's like, because it's free, in that case, that's part of the argument, is like, this new technology and it's shiny, and so, why not use it? And this is the trick that the technology industry has been relying on for, the last 30, 40 years of actually providing free buy-in to a system, and then creating the market dependency. And then with downstream data users that people who are in education might not immediately think of, but actually, people who work in data know very well that, you're harvesting data, you can train new models, you can do lots with it. And so, the implications there are profound. And we should, I think, as societies, like, we should be at a point where we're no longer naive about this. So when it comes to things like biometrics, things that are about, our personally identifiable bodily features. When it comes to things about, you know, age and children and domains like education, there are domain-specific regulations that can be put in place, that are already put in place around health, right? And so that I think is, we need to keep having these conversations. We need to understand how they intersect with a whole range of governance issues. They're not just, the digital is not this thing on the side. It's not this add-on. It's cutting through all the things that if you care about politics, you have to care about it one way or the other. And I hope to see, you know, research on this topic coming out from your center.
Yes, we have, I think I'm saying we have, I'm sure Mandina as well, we are very much intrigued, and there are a lot of insights that we have as well gained from everyone's contributions, and especially you, Toussaint. And yes, I'm just curious as well, from an advocacy perspective, a digital rights group that you work with. I understand that you are acknowledging the areas for concern and needing attention, like the need for biometric consciousness, the concerns with privatization of public goods, and so on. Are there practical recommendations that you are proposing to stakeholders through the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, one is automatic inclusion of civil society in discussions around procurement of large-scale technologies in the country. There are implications for and recommendations for news media, because news media, I think, tend to not do a great job at covering these issues. News media are like this intermediary that are supposed to, you know, convey information to people about these technologies. And yet they generally rely on, you know, whatever press release they've been given by either the government or companies. So I think there's space there to just create, you know, news coverage that's going to bring in more perspective and is going to invite everyday people in that space. And then I think, you know, and I guess this is a bit from, you know, not necessarily an outsider perspective, but someone who at the moment doesn't live on the African continent, but I think there are like, you know, financial support to networks that need to happen, because, you know, small group of people well organized can very much advance a lot of this conversation. It takes a lot of energy. And so I think a recommendation too is that we find ways to sustain these communities in a way that they can actually keep on doing what they've already been doing. And at the moment, you know, this sort of institutionalization of this advocacy is very, you know, it's very precarious. And so it doesn't rely on much except, you know, the energy and the passion of people who care about human rights and technology. And so I think, you know, for any funder, philanthropic funder who's listening, you know, I think there are, you know, things that can be done there in supporting that. So I think, you know, just on that advocacy front, these are sort of three ways it could be done. Yeah. And I think, you know, honestly, I think it's also going to happen just because, you know, that's the hopeful in me, but I think, I do think that, you know, people are slowly, like as societies, we're slowly getting to the point of being less naive about data and digital technologies. And hopefully that keeps going in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you, Toussaint. I believe one final question from Clément. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I wanted just to add something on top of what Toussaint was saying. I like the way you mentioned about media news. And I think for me, the one of the important aspect for this is about information. I don't know, when we're talking about advocacy, I don't know all those NGOs. You can talk about the global NGOs, they are well informed, but local NGOs, they are even informed about this, how they can advocate something that you don't have any information. You know, how you can advocate to something, the local NGOs, they are not informed about the AI in more general. And then this is the first things, the first step for me is more about information. You need to inform the all those associations, to explain them about facial recognition technologies, and then more general about AI in more general. That is just send me to one point that maybe to Sydney mentions about recommendation. We have been hosting last month teaching and AI symposium here in Rennes School of Business. And then we realized that even at the European level, with the GPT, there are still the real issues. There's no regulation. They're still looking at how we can regulate this at the European level. If in the developed country, they are still not have a very clear regulation because of overwhelming challenges, because different challenges emerging. So you need, first of all, to have all of the issues before providing a regulation that are going to cover all of this. So we are still having the emerging issues coming around the use of AI. So even at European level, this issue. So that's kind of just taking to give that this recommendation that I think we need to discuss at the European Union level in terms of recommendation. European Union level, this is not for just leaving open to a single country to come with legislation, regulation. I think we need to, at the European level, African Union level, to have a commission that's going to work on this and provide us a guideline that can help each and every country in Africa to rely on this and develop its own regulation and the policy. Because at the European level, they see the challenge. What about Africa? What about Africa where we are not well equipped? I think information and also kind of working at the continent level, providing guidelines that can inspire countries to develop their own policy and strategy, for me to be the best idea in order to, to adapt to this phenomenon that is very overwhelming. We can't stop it. It's part of artificial intelligence, yes.
Yeah, and Clément, I mean, just I completely agree. And one project I want to plug in here is from someone I mentioned already in the talk, Nanjala Nyabola from Kenya, because one of the things that she experienced was that, so she did a lot of advocacy in Kenya around digital ID, and she realized that even the language that she or the other NGOs or civil society groups would use to talk about this, it was always in English, and they did have words in Swahili to talk about privacy or algorithm or net neutrality or these concepts. And so she actually, when she was at our lab, she worked on a project to translate, to come up with a list of these words, and then work with linguists and experts in different countries in East Africa to translate these words into Kiswahili and to create a vocabulary that people could use. And then she's turned to news organizations who do, reporting in Kiswahili to say, oh, now you don't have to report about this only in English. Like you can use, here's, encouraging them to develop just a local language to talk about this. And this is also one of the, I think, important recommendations there in terms of thinking about, local solutions, local frameworks, local engagement. I think the language question is also very, very key, also to bring in these perspectives that are uniquely contextual and cultural. Yeah.
All right. That's totally right.
Okay, Zahara, we are very short on time. A very quick final question.
Yeah, hello everyone. That was a very good and clear presentation. My quick question is, what is the most vulnerable part of the facial recognition that people are vulnerable to within the society?
Well, I think, I'm going to give an unsatisfactory answer. I think it depends on the context. Like there are some contexts where I think the racial biases, like for instance, in the US, where that's going to be tremendously harmful, and that's going to be the most dangerous one. There are contexts where mass surveillance and privacy, especially like sort of politically motivated surveillance, are going to be the most damaging. There are other contexts where it's more just the sort of general loss of privacy. But I think it falls on that scale of things that I mentioned. privacy surveillance and racial biases. And it's not just hypothetical. I mean, there's been people in different parts of the world who've been, wrongly convicted or identified of, form of crimes because of facial recognition technology. And I can't remember the exact quote, but there's this case in the US where, there's a guy telling the police, like this isn't me, like this image you're showing me is not me. And the police officers telling them, well, the machine says it's you, right? So, these are not just hypothetical, they're actually cases that are already happening. And so, how that plays out on the scanning of profiles for people applying for jobs or applying for housing, this is going to be very context specific, but enough to raise concerns in any way where it's rolled out. Thank you for your question and your nice comments about the talk, Zahra, too.
You're welcome.
All right then. So Imam Din, should we close the session, right? Okay, yeah. So very, very much thank you to Dr. Toussaint Notias for a very insightful lecture presentation.
Oh,
no.
I think it just got frozen. So
I think she's free.
I take over then. So it was just to say goodbye. Thank you very much for being here. Also, just make you aware about we're going to have other 2 lecture series, one in October and one in December. So we're going to share the information about it. So please join again if you liked today's session. And so we're going to also send you the video if it's okay. So we're still going to talk then with Toussaint, if that's going to be okay. And Adila, you're back. So I was just taking over quickly, saying thank you and reminding about the future lecture series. If you just want to give the final word.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I got disconnected for some reason. And I was just going to share the future lecture series. Yeah, here it is. The next one would be in, sorry. For some reason, this is free. Okay, yeah, the next one would be in October by Dr. Luwam Dirar. It's going to be on norms of solidarity and regionalism, theorizing state behavior among Southern African states. So keep a look, keep an eye on our social media pages and our LinkedIn page and our emails that we send. You will receive invitation for the next lecture series in the upcoming months or so. So on that note, thank you very much. And if you wish to contact us, this is our email address and our website as well, which is mentioned on the slide here. So we should end the recording. Thank you very much again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here and for the invitation. Take care.
Thank you very much. Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.